This is an amazing story that I'm calling the Florida Miracle. It's a story of my father, who several years ago, a minister of the gospel, literally died, was brain dead for 3 days, and God brought him back alive. I wrote a little booklet about that. I've got it in front of you. I've shared it over the years, never charged anything for it. Tells the story of my dad. What a story it is. I want to share that with you this morning. I'm Marlin Jaynes. I am a person personally fighting for a miracle in my life. I've been diagnosed with left bile liver cancer, going through treatment. It's considered very aggressive and serious. Unless God performs a physical miracle for me, my time is very short. But I'm going to share this amazing story of how God restored life to my dad. My dad was a minister of the gospel for many years, but he was declared brain dead by doctors in Florida after 3 EEG tests showed no brain activity. And I'm going to be sharing from this book, so if I glance at it, it's a story that happened several years ago. Actually, let me tell you about it. On Sunday afternoon, February the 5th in 1989, at the suggestion of doctors at the Southwestern Regional Hospital in Fort Myers, Florida, I called Mr. Ed or Sid Oakley of the Oakley Cook Funeral Home in Bristol, Tennessee, and began to make arrangements for Sid to have my dad's body flown back to Tennessee to plan his funeral. You see, the decision had been made by myself and my mother to remove Dad from life support. He said the doctors had told me that Dad's heart would stop beating within minutes to hours at the most after we made this decision. But let me back up and start at the beginning of the story. It was on a Friday, February the 3rd in 1989. This day started out as a usual day for me in Northeast Tennessee and Bristol, where I lived. And at the time, I was pastoring the Anderson Church of God in Bristol, Virginia, where I would serve for 27 years. I'm now the minister at Oakwood Forest Christian Church in Kingsport, where I've been almost 14 years. But backing up to February the 3rd, 1989, it started out as a usual day for me in Northeast Tennessee. I got up, as I still do, in the early hours of the morning between 4 and 5 a.m. I ate a healthy breakfast of a couple of cookies and had something to drink, and I began to study. My youngest daughter, Marlin, was up, and then she was off to school. My oldest daughter, Brenda, and my wife, Karen, were soon up and busy at their tasks. I stayed busy making up a prayer list in preparation for our Sunday services at the church I was pastoring in Bristol. Now, the weather was very unusual and exceptional for February. It was up, I believe, that day to 72 degrees, as best I can remember. I followed my normal routine of making calls at the hospital and various other calls going by my office at the church. Then later in the afternoon, it began to start to rain. The temperature began to drop, and bad weather soon had moved in on us. I got home around 3 p.m. that day, and Karen and Brenda and Marlene and I were getting ready to go to supper at the home of my cousin, Dan Jackson, in Kingsport. We'd been invited to come over for supper, and we were getting ready to do that. But before we left, the phone rang. And when I answered the phone, the operator said, this was the day before the cell phones, or cell phones were very primitive in those days, and I didn't have one. My home phone rang, and the operator said, will you accept a collect call from the Southwestern Regional Hospital? Well, my reply was, I don't know if I will or not. Who's calling me? And where is this hospital? A voice at the other end said, it's a call for Reverend Jaynes. Well, I'm a minister. My name is Reverend Jaynes. I'm a junior. I'm Marlin S. Jaynes Jr. My dad was Marlin S. Jaynes Sr. So that didn't explain a lot. But something in my mind seemed to say my parents used to pastor down in Florida, and they'd gone down for a couple of months during the winter, and I knew they were there, and I thought, ask if this hospital is in Fort Myers, Florida. I did, and the answer was yes. And so immediately I accepted the call, not knowing exactly what was going on, but knowing that my parents were visiting friends in Fort Myers where they used to pastor and live. At the other end of the phone was a local Church of God minister. I did not know him personally. His name was Pastor Clark. He pastored a church at that time at Cape Coral, the Cape Coral Church of God. He told me that my dad was in the CCU unit of the hospital there and was having a heart attack. Brother Clark told me that he was there with my mother at the time. I asked him what the situation was concerning my father's condition, and he told me that the doctor said that Dad had a 50-50 chance of survival. I then talked to my mother, who was put on the phone, and told her I would be down just as soon as I could get a flight out of Bristol, and I'd call her back as soon as I knew what the plane schedule was. Within 2.5 hours, I found myself on, this airline's gone now, many of you remember Eastern Airline, on an Eastern Metro flight from the Tri-City Regional Airport to Atlanta, Georgia, where then I picked up a direct flight on Eastern to Fort Myers, Florida. I arrived in Fort Myers at 10 o'clock that night, on a Friday night. I was met at the airport by a good friend of my folks, who then drove me to where my father's car was. I got the car and then drove on immediately to the hospital. By 11 p.m., I was by my father's side, and I could see at once that Dad was motionless, and I was soon to discover that Dad was brain dead. Let me tell you more of the story. During the night, I was allowed to go back and forth to see my dad anytime I wanted. And that's unusual for someone that's in a CCU or an ICU unit. And as I would look there with the nurse by his side, Dad just laid there. He was hooked up to life support equipment that was keeping his body alive. And as I began to communicate with the nurse, I asked about the possibility, did my dad have a stroke? Since he was making no response. Well, the nurse wasn't able to tell me much. She said, you'll have to ask the doctor when he comes in later in the morning. You see, I then began to discover I didn't know the total story. I thought when I flew down there and received the phone call that Dad had simply had a heart attack, that the rescue squad was there within 5 minutes, and that things were normal. But you see, this was far from the real story that was taking place and that was beginning to unfold. I began to learn that Dad had been busy as usual on that Friday ministering to the needs of hurting people. The Bellamy family, where he and my mother were staying, were depending upon them. And they were helping Mr. Bellamy, who was in the last stages of bone cancer. A few days earlier, Mr. Bellamy had hit his shoulder against a bathroom wall. He had broken his arm. He already was unable to get himself up from a chair or to go to bed on his own. On this particular Friday, Dad had taken Mr. Bellamy for x-rays, and they had returned home. And Dad decided to wash his car, after which he came in feeling tired. He laid down while my mother cooked for them and the Bellamys. Mom went to get Dad up when it was time to eat, but she could not wake him up. Mrs. Bellamy heard my mother hollering and saying, Marlin, wake up. She came to see what was wrong. Dad had already turned blue. He was foaming at the mouth. The rescue squad was called, which was just a few blocks away, and they were on the scene within 10 minutes. And when they arrived, they worked on Dad between 40 and 45 minutes. trying to get his heart restarted. I was to learn that they shocked him 5 times and they gave him 5 injections. Now, that's unusual for a person to be shocked that many times. And for the paramedics to labor that long trying to get a heart restarted. But they were unable to restart my dad's heart. I was to learn more information weeks later. What happened then next was they put Dad in a body bag. And they took him to the hospital to have him pronounced dead. When the doctor checked him after opening the body bag at the ER, they found a slight heartbeat. So they rushed Dad to the CCU unit and connected him to life support, where he remained in a comatose condition. And this is the condition that I found my dad in when I arrived at the hospital on that Friday night. Everything medical was done. But we could see after 3 days that Dad was gone. And he had been gone from the very beginning. 3 separate tests proved that there was no brain activity at all in the upper 2 areas of the brain. There was slight activity in the brain stem, which is the part of the brain that controls involuntary breathing and so on. The specialist basically told us, your dad's dead. But if his body should survive, he would never be Marlin again. We were told that he at best would be in an unconscious state, that he'd never speak another word. He would never open his eyes again. He would never think. He would never know anything. All the areas of the brain were dead. Medically, Dad was brain dead, with only life support equipment maintaining his breathing. On Sunday, February the 5th, 1989, the decision was made. After talking with my mother, I asked that the life support equipment be removed. And since this was the decision and it was confirmed by the doctors to be the right one, they moved Dad out of the CCU unit and took him to a private room in another wing of the hospital where we could remain with him in his final minutes or hours. We were told that pneumonia had already set in, and Dad was listed no code, meaning no heroic measures would be used to extend his life. No medicine of any kind was given to him. He only had oxygen and an IV with sugar water for nourishment. Absolutely nothing else. No drugs, nothing else. And it was now time to wait for the body to die, since the brain was already gone. Certainly this was the hardest decision my mother and I ever had to make. I told my mother, Mom, the Lord has taken Dad, and we must trust the Lord to do what is best. We've ministered to many people over the years, and we've told them to put their trust in the Lord at such times as this. It's now time for us to practice what we preached. Now, I know it's hard, Mom, but we must place Dad in the hands of the Lord. I believe Dad's already with the Lord. My mother said to me, but I don't want to give up hope. And I told my precious mother, Lord, if the Lord wants to bring Dad back to us, it'll be without the life support. It'll be without the doctors. It'll be without the medicine. If Dad comes back, the doctors, the nurses, and everyone else will know that it's a real miracle from God. With tears in our eyes, we faced the reality that my dad was already with the Lord. Later that night, on a Sunday night, I was by myself with my dad, and I prayed for him. I would quote scripture during the night to him. I literally cried over him. After several hours, his eyes opened for the first time after I asked him to look at a baseball card that my youngest daughter, Marlin, who was an avid baseball card collector at that time, had given me as I boarded the plane on Friday evening. Marlene told me, and she loved her grandpa so dearly, Grandpa will understand when he sees the card. And I thought again I was going to just a heart attack victim who would be awake and would see the card. But the first time since his heart attack, Dad responded, he opened his eyes and he looked at that card. Later on, I got him to squeeze my hand. The hours went on and the morning came, and my mother and my aunt, Argent Irwood, who recently went to be with the Lord, she returned to the room. And I left for a couple hours to clean up and try to rest because I'd been awake all night long. It was then I prayed, Lord, if you want to keep my dad, that's fine. Just make it quick. Allow his body to die. But if for some reason you want Dad to come back to us, I believe that you can perform a miracle in his behalf. Now, certainly I did not know which way God was going to work at this point of time, but I knew it was now out of the doctor's hands. It was in the hands of our Heavenly Father. After hours of working with my dad on Monday, he would open his eyes and he would look at us. 4 different times I got him to squeeze my hand. Of course, there was also those low moments when Dad would not respond. The doctors and the nurses, they thought that I was imagining the response that I had seen from my dad because they had not witnessed it. The doctors only checked on him once a day because they considered him brain dead. And when Dad would respond, I reported it to the nurses or to my mother and aunt. Argent had come down from Orlando along with her husband, Jack, to be with Mom and me. I'm so thankful for the help they were at that time. I also am thankful that they were there to hear Dad when he was brain dead, to hear what the doctors had told us, and then to see God perform a miracle in his behalf. You see, this miracle was not done in secret. There were many witnesses to it. I can remember on Wednesday, the excitement when Dad, in the early hours of the morning, opened his eyes and he saw me eating a donut. I asked him, I said, Dad, would you like to have a donut in a couple of days? And Dad said, that sounds good. Then came, well, he didn't actually say that. I said to him, does that sound good, Dad? And then came his first word, yep. Oh, what a response. Tears rolled down our face as Mom and Argent and I heard that first word. Yes. Whether the doctors believed it or not, Dad was alive. Later in the day, Dad told his sister Argent that she was pretty. Wednesday, the neurologist was called back on the case for a reevaluate. Since by now the nurses had seen responsive life. And even one of his heart doctors had witnessed some activity from this brain dead patient. When the neurologist came in, however, Dad was in a deep sleep and would not respond to him. Of course, he thought we were crazy. But again, I believe God was at work, wanting man to take no credit for this miracle. However, this was a low time for us. On Thursday morning, Dad began to respond more and more for us, and now also for the nurses. It was evident something was happening. On Thursday, I asked Dad to be removed from the no-code classification. Midnight Wednesday, my father's youngest brother, George Jaynes, who at that time was the mayor of Washington County, Tennessee, where Johnson City and Jonesboro are located. He and his son, Pat, picked up my wife, Karen, and our daughters, Brenda and Marlin, at our home in Bristol, here in Northeast Tennessee at the time where we lived. And they began the long trip of around 900 miles to Fort Myers. They arrived in the mid-afternoon on a Thursday after driving all night. It was good to have more support from home to see my uncle and his son, certainly my wife and my 2 daughters. They talked to Dad. And he would respond at times, not always, but at times. On Friday morning, February the 10th, my oldest daughter, Brenda, and I were alone in his hospital room there in Fort Myers. We've been playing some tapes of a radio program that was called then In the Word. I had a daily and a weekly program for 15 years on a radio station at Bristol, and some of the tapes they had brought down, and Dad would listen, and he'd even sing to the music. And after about an hour and a half of this, listening to this tapes, Dad began to tell an amazing story to Brenda and I. And this is where it really begins to get exciting. Dad told us that he had been to heaven for the past 3 days. He began to tell us about the beautiful bright light. He said, heaven is so wonderful. It's so beautiful. Oh, how precious is the light. Then Dad began to tell us about seeing his brother-in-law, Kenneth Jackson, in heaven. Kenneth had died several years earlier, and Dad and I held his funeral. He also told us about seeing another precious friend of his who had died, Rupert T. Green. He told us he had saw many, many people in heaven. Brenda asked him, Grandpa, have you seen anyone from the Bible in heaven? And he told us yes. He said, I've seen Paul and Silas. I asked Dad if he had seen Jesus. Immediately, Dad grabbed my hands and he pulled them close to his heart and he said, yes, Jesus, the light is beautiful. The light is so wonderful. And Dad talked about the light with Brenda and I for a while. And then he told us, he said, I did not want to come back, that he did not want to leave heaven. And I asked him, well, why did you come back, Dad? And he said, Jesus wanted me to come back. Many souls to be saved, many to be healed. This was all that Dad shared with us about heaven that Friday morning. Since then, he would mention different times later over the weeks and months and years the light and how wonderful the Lord is. He would speak a great deal about love. He shared with emotion some of the more about heaven after he would come home and over the years later. After telling Brenda and I about heaven, Dad asked for his Bible. I told him it was at the Bellamy's and that I would call Mother, and when she came up to the hospital, that I'd have her bring the Bible. He told her there was something he wanted us to see in the Bible, or he told Brenda and I that. When Mom got the Bible and brought it to the hospital, I looked in it. Suddenly, I discovered a piece of paper which he had written the words, to depart and be with the Lord is for better. What a message for someone to write just before his visit to heaven. I realized that Dad wanted us to know how wonderful heaven is and what a privilege to be with Jesus. Of course, as you realize, this statement is a paraphrase of Paul's writing in Philippians 1:23, which says, for I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is for better. Dad's desire had been fulfilled for at least 3 days. But God sent him back on a mission for a witness of God's almighty power and his loving mankind. On Friday afternoon, February the 10th, exactly 1 week from when Dad had died from a heart attack, I called his heart doctor and asked if he thought that he could be transferred by air ambulance to the Johnson City Medical Center in Johnson City, Tennessee. He said he thought this was possible if my dad had a doctor there that would accept him during the flight and, of course, upon his arrival. I gave the doctor in Florida the name of Dr. Ralph Mills, who was our family doctor and Dad's doctor in Tennessee at the time. Great doctor, great friend. Calls were made and the process for transfer was begun. That night, exactly 1 week from my arrival in Fort Myers, Florida, I drove Dad's car along with my wife and daughters, heading back to Tennessee, driving straight through. and arriving just before noon on Saturday. My dad's brother George and his son Pat remained in Fort Myers to see that Dad was placed on the air ambulance that we chartered, along with my mother. So on Saturday morning, Dad left the hospital by ambulance and was placed on an air ambulance and flown from Fort Myers, Florida, to the Tri-City Regional Airport near our home in Tennessee. I met the plane at the airport when it arrived at 1:15 on Saturday afternoon. I boarded the plane and talked to my dad and mom and the medical crew that accompanied him on the flight. They told me that Dad had sung to them, that had talked about things during the entire flight. Dad was then transferred by ambulance to the Johnson City Medical Center. What a miracle had already taken place. But the story is far from over, my friends. Stay with me if you want to hear something exciting. Upon arrival, Dad was immediately placed in the CC unit of the Johnson City Medical Center. And I told the doctors and the people there, this is a mistake. And soon they could quickly see that that was a step backward. After an examination, Dad was placed in a regular room. That evening, Dad ate his first meal since his heart attack and being brain dead 8 days earlier. The doctors began to study his Florida records, and they soon realized they were looking at a miracle. After his arrival at the Johnson City Medical Center, it was discovered that Dad had suffered a stroke during that flight home. However, God was working on a miracle in his behalf. We saw Dad go from being in bed to sitting in a chair and then walking. He was eating and he was able to feed himself at times. He was talking with us, even though at times he seemed confused. It was exciting to see Dad pick up a Gideon New Testament on a Saturday afternoon on February the 25th. And there in that hospital room, turn to 2 Corinthians, the 2nd chapter, verse 3 and 4, and read out loud to us. And I wrote this same unto you, lest when I came I should have sorrow from them of whom I ought to rejoice, having confidence in you, that my joy is the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart, I wrote unto you with many tears, not that you should be grieved, but you might know the love which I have more abundantly unto you. Man, what an amazing statement for someone that had been brain dead. On Thursday, March the 2nd, Dad was moved from the regular section of the hospital to the special rehab unit, which was at that time on the 6th floor. This was 2 weeks earlier than the doctors originally thought that it would be possible. They went through physical and occupational and speech therapy. Dad continued to improve. On Tuesday, March the 28th, Dad was released from the hospital and he went to his own home. It was good now to see that Dad could feed himself, walk without help, shave and dress himself. He typed, he wrote, he talked on the phone. He did basically whatever he wanted to do. I might also mention that the first thing that Dad did the day that I brought him home from the hospital was to pray. Stand by his car and he said, "Thank you, Lord, for bringing me home. I want to do whatever you want me to do." Then what a victory it was when he entered his house and he knew where everything was. Another step of victory was achieved when Dad attended the midweek service on Wednesday night, April the 2nd, at the Anderson Church of God in Bristol, where I was serving as pastor. Those in attendance were blessed as they heard his humble and touching prayer during the service. Then again, on April the 9th, Dad attended the Sunday morning worship service. Many tears were shed as he was greeted by our church people. It was great to hear him amening the message as I preached. Then one evening shortly after that, Brenda and my wife Karen and my other daughter Marlin and I visited Dad with tears in his eyes. He shared from his living room couch about heaven. He said that he saw a lot of small children and babies in heaven. Karen, my wife, asked Dad what Jesus was like, and Dad said, he was very humble. He was not like a lot of people think. He was not, I love this, a flashy sort of guy. Dad had to share a lot more to share with us. Different times, days later, he would share concerning heaven and other things that he had experienced during this ordeal. He had come a long way since February the 3rd. The doctors have admitted that a miracle had took place. The nurses confirmed it. His therapist stated that they didn't believe that he would ever do the things that he done. At a checkup on April the 11th, his doctor, general practitioner, family doctor, Dr. Ralph Mills, told us that the next summer, a year from this summer, that he expected Dad to return to Fort Myers and walk in the hospital and present himself to the doctors there and say, "I'm the fella that you all said was dead. Look at me now." Well, my only comment was, it could be sooner than that. On April the 16th, the first time since his heart attack, Dad not only attended the Sunday morning worship service, but also the Sunday night service. He visited his Sunday school class and was greeted by his students with open arms. Then he enjoyed the morning service, and by Sunday evening, he was ready to come back to church. I asked him, "Dad, would you like to sit up on the platform?" Which he did. And he was into the service right from the beginning. Our music director was out of town, so I asked Dad if he'd like to lead the singing. He in turn asked a lady in our church who had never led the singing to lead it. And she did, and did an excellent job. You could hear Dad singing, enjoying the service. Then I said, "Dad, would you lead in prayer?" And he prayed a heartwarming prayer for the requests that had been offered. Later, he shared in testimony and he led the congregation in the hymn, "It is truly wonderful what the Lord has done." After I preached, a lady came forward wanting prayer for a friend's son in Florida who was in a coma and was considered brain dead, like Dad had been recently. Dad led in a powerful prayer for this man. Just think of that. A man who was once brain dead was now praying for a person that was in that same condition. What a mighty God we serve, my friends. Everyone who attended this service could sense that we had been in the presence of one who had been in the presence of the Lord. On Monday, April the 17th, Dad had an appointment with his cardiologist at the time, Dr. Charles Allen of Johnson City. After a complete examination and, of course, an EKG, he told Dad that he was doing great. Dr. Allen stated that he felt his memory would continue to improve. The doctor cut back on Dad's heart medicine. On Tuesday evening, April the 18th, Dad visited a lady in our church that's gone on years ago to be with the Lord, Edith Pierce, one of his Sunday school class members who had been in the hospital 3 times in the past month. What a mighty prayer he prayed for her. Then I received word that another class member of his, Sister Edith Dale, the mother of Carol Dale, the famous Green Bay Packer super champion wide receiver, Super Bowl champion. She had fallen on Tuesday evening and she was in the hospital with a fractured shoulder and a broken wrist. And when I told Dad about this on Wednesday morning, he insisted that he must go to the hospital to pray for her. I took him to see her on Wednesday afternoon. After a friendly visit, Dad prayed for her pain to be relieved and that God would touch her body and encourage her. The next day, as I visited Sister Dale in the hospital, she told me that she had to have had suffered a great deal of pain before Dad prayed for her. And she said, "But when Brother Jaynes prayed for me yesterday, I could feel the power of God. I knew that God had answered my prayer and had touched me. I haven't had any pain medicine since, and I have not been suffering." Also during this visit, Sister Dale's daughter, Mrs. Jean Boss of Tampa, Florida, the lady who had asked Dad to pray for her friend in Florida who was brain dead, told me that she had talked to the friend's loved one, and now that young man was wide awake and that he would live. The doctors had told this lady if her son lived that he would be a vegetable, just like my dad, would never function normally again. Those were similar words to us. We had heard the same words about Dad. And what a mighty witness to the fact that Dad had told Brenda and I while he was in that hospital in Fort Myers, Florida, that God had sent him back, that many would be saved and many would be healed. Now God was doing that through Dad. Dad had told us weeks earlier that he was going to come back for that purpose. He had come back from the dead. The story about my dad's death and return to life has been a blessing to many people who have heard it around the country over the years. We had over those past years many calls and letters. There was visits from friends, loved ones, even strangers who had been praying for Dad. We made tapes that we sent out that people had requested about the story. And we believe that someday Dad would tell the story and truly souls would be saved and many would be healed, as he said this was the reason that God had called him back from the dead. One of the therapists said concerning what she had seen and heard about Dad, it said it almost makes you believe. I pray that she did become a believer. This young lady was doing a case study on Dad. Actually, several studies were done on him because of his remarkable return from being brain dead. We've been told several times by doctors that Dad is writing the book on his condition, that they'd never seen anyone come back from what he did medically. And it was amazing. Dad is the Florida miracle. As Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm hoping this story is a blessing to you. The story hasn't ended. There's more to it, because on Friday, April the 21st, Elmer Bellamy passed away in Fort Myers, Florida of that year. He was a man who Dad had taken care of for his treatment for cancer and who Dad was visiting when Dad suffered his heart attack. The interesting thing is Dad was not surprised at Elmer Bellamy's death. As a matter of fact, 2 weeks earlier, Dad prayed for Elmer's family during their bereavement. It seemed that Dad knew what was going to happen long before it did. On Saturday morning, April the 22nd, Reverend Byram Lee, the state coordinator at that time for the Church of God in Virginia, called and asked if he could come and visit with my dad. Of course, it was okay. I was there when Reverend Lee and his wife and good friend and my parents, or a good friend of my parents from First Church of God in Abington, came. And after some conversation, Brother Lee asked Dad if he would recall any of his out-of-body experiences. Dad replied, yes, I do. But it seems at first Dad wasn't ready to say anything about his experience, of which I have shared earlier in this report. You see, Dad didn't always share. Sometimes he said he wasn't allowed to say certain things. But Reverend Lee told of his wife, who had a very unusual experience. His wife, who was a registered nurse, was a very close friend of Reverend Lee's first wife, shared about an experience which took place when his first wife was dying. The first Sister Lee died of cancer a few years ago, and the present Sister Lee and another friend was staying with her that night. The night before the first wife died to go be with the Lord, this lady told us, I just checked Sister Lee's vitals and I could tell that she was rapidly leaving us. When all of a sudden I began to hear trumpets which were so beautiful and were being played in such beautiful harmony like I never heard before. I thought I was imagining this, but it continued to get louder and louder. The lady said she went to the window thinking that maybe that the time had gotten away, and she was hearing a high school band that was practicing marching nearby. But when she pulled back the curtain, she realized it was still night and there was no band in sight. At that point, she said, the other lady in the room said, did you hear the trumpets too? They had both heard them. And one said, these are the trumpets of the Lord. Don't you see Jesus? This lady that was dying told these two ladies, he's right here in front of me. Of course, we didn't see anything the two ladies said, but we did hear the trumpets. Then the trumpets quit, and Reverend Lee's wife passed away. As the story was related, Dad said, "Yes, that's right. That's exactly how it is. The trumpets are so beautiful." And tears were running down his face as he agreed with the experience of this lady who had gone to be with the Lord. After the story was finished, Dad started talking about his own experience of death and going to be with Jesus. Again, he told of seeing Kenneth Jackson, his brother-in-law, who had died several years earlier. And he said, "I talked to Kenneth for a long time. I shook his hand." He told us that Kenneth had some people that had doubts, but that they shouldn't, that everything was okay with him. And Dad talked about how hard it is to tell some of the things that he experienced and saw in heaven. Reverend Lee asked him if it was like Paul's experience, which he wasn't allowed to share everything. And Dad replied, "That's exactly the way it is. Some things I just cannot talk about." Now, I won't report all the things that my dad shared over those weeks and months and years, but there are many of us that know that this is reality. My mother, my dad's sister, Arjun Irwood, the Lees, Frida Johnson, myself, others. I could tell you many of the church people that heard, my wife, my daughters. They heard a lot of these things. But let me go back. On April the 23rd, it was to bring excitement as Dad came to the morning worship service. And as my wife, Karen, beautiful singer, she sang a solo just before it was time for me to preach. And God shared with me that He wanted me to preach a different message than I had planned. Only seconds before Karen had finished singing, God gave me the text of 1 Thessalonians, the 4th chapter, verses 13 through 18, where Paul talks about a Christian upon death going to be with the Lord and how he will come with those departed saints at the end of time. I felt led to ask Dad if he'd like to come and sit on the platform as I preached. He said he would. And at the close of the message, which I certainly give God the credit for, I realized why I felt impressed to ask Dad to come forward. Dad began to give the altar call. Unexpected. And soon the altar is filled with precious souls. Once again, God was fulfilling the reason that Dad told us that God sent him back, in order that many be saved, many to be healed. Could any present there doubt the miracle that we was witnessing before our very eyes? There were few dry eyes when that service was over. On Sunday night, my dad was back in the service, and this time I asked him once again to come and sit on the platform at the beginning of the service. During the service, he led the main prayer for the sick and various needs. Truly, this was a touching prayer. And after Sarah Weingart, a young lady who was attending our church then, sang, I asked Dad if he would like to share a testimony before he preached. He said, yes, I have a word or two to share. He opened his Bible and he turned to 1 John, the 1st chapter, verses 4 through 9, and then he shared a message with us for the next 40 minutes. Everyone was spellbound as we heard Dad preach, and he preached right to the needs of each of us that were there. I realized that we were witnessing another miracle. Wouldn't the doctors in Florida be surprised to have witnessed this miracle? Even the doctors, when he left the hospital in Johnson City, some told us that Dad would never preach again. How wrong they were. I want to tell you, we serve a wonderful and all-powerful God. He's the God of miracles. And before our eyes, we were witnessing another miracle. I thought perhaps in weeks, maybe months down the road, I would hear Dad preach again. But I certainly wasn't prepared to witness it this early. Yet God was with us. And certainly with Dad, as Dad opened his Bible and shared in love and tears that blessed, tears that were preaching the precious word. Powerfully, Dad said, listen, this is what he said. This is the message we have heard from him. And we announce to you that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. 1 John 1:6. When it comes to Dad and the recovery he had, nothing surprised us. Who knows, we thought, how God would use him next. Then I'm going to jump forward to Wednesday, April the 26th, 1989. That day, we took Dad to the Gate City Funeral Home in Gate City, Virginia, to pay respects for that family friend that I mentioned earlier, Elmer Bellamy, who had passed away on April the 21st in 1989 in Fort Myers, who had been brought back to Gate City for the funeral. After visiting the funeral home, we took Dad to the home of Gary Dykes, son-in-law of Elmer Bellamy, where we visited with Mr. Bellamy's widow, Billy Bellamy, extended our sympathy to him. By the way, this was the first time that she had seen Dad since he was removed by ambulance from her home after suffering the heart attack. She was so glad to see him as he approached her in his navy blue suit. During our visit, I asked her for more details about Dad's heart attack. Since the week that I was at their home, it was a very hectic time. It was I didn't know all the details. And Billy told us that it took about 10 minutes for the rescue squad to arrive when Mother found Dad. Told us about working with him for 45 minutes, which I mentioned before, ministering 5 shocks to his heart and the 5 injections, Dad leaving in the body bag. We actually did not know when his heart was restarted. It had to be in the ER, as the hospital was waiting for the doctor to pronounce him dead. So it was at least an hour before they discovered a heartbeat after Mother had found him. And also we found out that when Dad had been praying for the family of Elmer Bellamy a couple of weeks before he died, Elmer had actually lost all recognition of current things and people at that time. On Thursday, the 27th of April, I took Dad to the Johnson City to his urologist, another good doctor friend, Dr. David Jones, who had done cancer surgery on him a couple of years earlier. They had treated him while he was in the Johnson City Medical Center and Rehab Unit. Dr. Jones gave him an excellent report on his cancer situation and also said his treatment of him during the recent hospitalization had gone well. Here's what Dr. Jones said. God certainly has done something miraculous in your life, and he's continuing to bless you. God did something mighty big for you. It's truly a miracle. May the 18th, 1989. I was talking with my neighbor, Ron Hartsock, to whom I'd given a copy of the story up to that point. And he was sharing how he had made copies to share with his mother and friends. And one of the ladies that worked at that time with Ron saw the report and asked for a copy. Later, Ron was told that this report was shared with a local doctor, a businessman who was near death from cancer. I'll not mention his name at this point, but the man's story gave him great comfort, the story of Dad in his last hours as he faced death. This Christian doctor passed away about a week after reading the story. And how we're thankful that God's experience gave the man the needed assurance to face death victoriously. Also, I'd like to add to this report that the Bristol Hell Carrier, Virginia Tennessean, reported Dr. Peter Goff, MD, entitled Technology Revises Death's Definition. Dr. Goff said, traditionally people were considered dead when their heart stopped beating. However, the event of resuscitation, maintaining a person's pulse by external compression, cardiac pacemakers, and cardiac surgery, during which the heart beating is suspended, doctors have had to revise their definition of death. Now, a person is judged to have died when brain function ceases, even though the patient's other organs are kept alive by artificial means such as respirators and dialysis and electronic pacemakers. That person can legally be pronounced dead if brain dead. Obviously, this is not simply unconsciousness. Brain death is diagnosed by a series of electronic brainwave tests. Such a distinction is important and has provided extensive work for the legal profession, stating in earnest with Karen Ann Quinlan case some years ago. Quinlan was kept alive, some of you may remember the story, artificially with machines for several months before her family petitioned a New Jersey court to allow her to be disconnected from life support. So the concept of death makes these decisions easier, the doctor went on to say. Once it has occurred, the patient is legally dead. Turning off the machines is not a cause of death then. This act becomes, if you will, a way of disconnecting interference in a normal terminal process. Now, I went through that process because that's what we did. Dad was first heart dead, later proclaimed brain dead, but Dad continued to make progress. His doctor at the time, Dr. Ralph Mills, would testify to that. Many old friends from various parts of the country came to see him. A Navy friend of his, a lifelong friend, Chase Stars, and his wife came from Anderson, Indiana. Another good minister friend that was his pastor when he first got saved, Robert Sauls, or what was Robert's brother, came from Delaware. So many people came to see Dad. And I don't want to make this story too long. I hope it's not boring to you, but the miracle continued to happen. Dad continued to live. One of the doctors, when he was in rehab, said that, you know, those doctors in Florida were wrong with their prediction with your dad. And Dad, that prediction he made about Dad, that Dad was never be able to walk or talk or eat again after he saw him, I thought, Dr. Spady, you were wrong too. And how wrong much of the medical profession was. You know, Dad was a living miracle. And I'm going to cut this story short. It goes on to a lot more facts that happened. But Dad lived for 10 more years. And I want to tell you the rest of the story as Dad was dying. Dad died from a fall. He broke his neck and pneumonia set in. And Dad would soon go back to heaven. I'm going to fast forward to May 1999. Many blessings had taken place, the miracles over those 10 years that God sent Dad back to us. However, I could see in the spring of 1999, Dad was getting weaker. I soon realized he wasn't going to be with us much longer. On April the 22nd, 1999, there was a 47-year-old man named Willis Poston, who I ministered to for 5 years, passed away. I had led Willis to the Lord after God miraculously saved his life from a brain aneurysm. I held his funeral service on 28th of April in 1999 at Oakley Cook Funeral Home in Bristol, Tennessee. Then I traveled at the family's request to the next day to Hartselle, South Carolina, where I conducted another service for Willis on April the 30th. After the service, I immediately head home. I'd been home less than an hour when my mother called me and said that Dad had fallen and I needed to come down to their house. They lived about 5 miles from me in Riverbend subdivision next to Bluff City. I rushed down where I thought my dad had fallen in the house and that he'd be all right. However, when I approached their home, the street was blocked with the rescue squad and the EMS ambulances. I jumped out of the car and I found Dad laying in the street. He had fallen in his driveway where it joins the street. He was bleeding. I could tell his injuries were serious. I followed the EMS ambulance to the Johnson City Medical Center. The ER doctor put stitches in the cuts in his face, sent him to x-rays, and we were soon to discover that his neck and his nose were broken, along with other injuries. From the very first, Dad wanted to die and go back to be with Jesus. He told me that Jesus was going to take him home. The doctors battled to save his life for the next 18 days. And during those 18 days, Dad shared with us that he was going to die. He remained a witness to people even while he was dying. He would sing old songs of victory And even other patients mentioned what a blessing he was as they would hear him from down the hall in their rooms. There were different times I was called back to the hospital when the doctors didn't think that I could even get there before Dad passed away. But each time he would rally. It was amazing that I didn't get a ticket on that 20-mile trip from Bristol to the hospital because I flat flew, my friends. However, that day did arrive that Dad told us he was going home to heaven. In the early hours of that morning on May the 18th in 1999, Dad took my precious wife Karen's hand that she had spent the night with him and said, "I'm going home today." He even talked about seeing his father and his mother and his oldest son, my brother that I never met, that died as a baby. And he said that they were there waiting for him. After lunch, I returned to the hospital to allow Karen to get some rest. And she'd only been gone for about 10 minutes when Dad began to leave us. So I held my dad's hand. I literally felt life depart and the hands become cold. I cried and I shouted at the same time. There in that room with only my mother, Dad, and myself, God called Dad to receive his crown of righteousness. He had fought a good fight. He had kept the victory. It had been won. Oh, there's so many stories I could share. Those were precious 10 years that God extended his life. And Dad was able to minister to so many people. Now, some of you may doubt this story. That's your problem. It's well documented. And I've enclosed some documentation in the little booklet I wrote. And I want to tell you again that Hebrews 13:8 declares Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today and forever. An interesting thing, 3 weeks from the evening that I held Willis Poston's funeral at Oakley Cook Funeral Home in Bristol, I stood in that same chapel before a crowd that was overflowing with family and friends to conduct my own father's funeral. We called that a service of victory and celebration for Marlin S. Jaynes Sr. I was assisted by my good friend, Elmer Lester, a wonderful friend over the years, used to be my associate at Bristol. I began the service by having everyone stand, and I led them in the great hymn, Amazing Grace. Next, my oldest daughter, Brenda, sang by a tape that she had recorded, My Life is in His Hands. Dad loved to hear Brenda sing. And then Reverend Elmer Lester shared the obituary, the scripture, thoughts, and prayer. Next, Brenda sang another song, Another Soldier Has Come Home. And then I shared the following message, which we sang after the message, Victory in Jesus, and concluded in prayer. My dad was buried on a hillside with military honors the next day at the Mountain Home Military Cemetery in Johnson City, Tennessee. A couple years ago, we buried my mother in the same grave. They're together there. Their bodies, their souls, they're with Jesus. A victory message for Reverend Marlin Jaynes Sr., shared by his son. Another soldier has come home. I use 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, verses 6-8, and the military records state honorable discharge from the United States Navy. This is to certify that Marlin Sanders Jaynes, a ship serviceman 3rd class barber, is honorably discharged from the U.S. Navy personal separation this first day of December 1945. This certificate is awarded to the testimonial fidelity and obedience. J.M. Libby, Lieutenant, United States Navy, by direction of commanding officer. The record goes on to state that Dad underwent air attack and bombings while serving on the island of Okinawa with the 36th United States Naval Construction Battalion, and that he performed his duties well and contributed greatly to the record of his battalion, entitled to wear the Asiatic Pacific ribbon with 3/16 Bronze Star, entitled to wear the American Theater ribbon, entitled to wear the CB shoulder insignia. I have those medals in my possession. They're precious. I also found a letter that was dated December the 22nd, 1945, written to my dad from James Forrestal, the Secretary of the Navy. And I want to share just a word or two from that. The Secretary Forrestal said, I have addressed this letter to reach you after the formalities of your separation from active service are complete. I've done so because without the formality that has clearly as I know how to say it, I want the Navy's pride in you, which is my privilege to express, to reach into your civil life and remain with you always. No other Navy at any time has done so much. For your part, these achievements, you deserve to be proud as long as you live. The nation which you serve at the time of crisis will remember you with gratitude. Sincerely yours, James Forrestal. My dad never would talk much about his days and what he experienced on the battlefields of World War II. But he was proud of his nation, and he felt it was an honor to serve his country as a soldier. But he had enlistment as a soldier in another army, and he was a good soldier, the army of the Lord. Paul writes in 2 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, verses 1 through 3, Therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things which thou hast heard from many witnesses, the same commit to faithful men, who shall be able to teach others, and also therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who has chosen him to be a soldier. And although Dad began to preach before and during World War II, he became very actively involved in ministry in 1945 after leaving the service. He started a church in California. Later, after the war, he owned his own barbershop in Kingsport, Tennessee, and he began to preach in churches in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia after the war. I remember those times we'd go to little country churches, and I was just a little boy. Dad would preach in those early years. He pastored in Goshen Valley, Tennessee, and Athens, Tennessee. 1948, he sold his business, and we all moved to Portland, Oregon, where Dad entered what was known as Pacific Bible College then, now known as Warner University in Portland, Oregon. While in college, he preached in churches in Oregon, Washington, Montana, pastored a church in Newburgh, Oregon. He graduated from the Pacific Bible College in 1952. We moved to Whitmore, South Carolina, where he pastored. Then it was on to Odessa, Texas. Then Dad started a church in DeLand, Florida, where I graduated from DeLand High School while we lived there. He pastored in Texas City, Texas, where I would meet my precious wife, Karen. And then next, Dad pastored a new church in Knoxville, Tennessee. After that, Chattanooga, Tennessee, LaGrange, Georgia, and his last pastorate was in Fort Myers. Many of these places, he built church buildings, and the churches grew. Yes, Dad was a great soldier, faithful soldier of the cross of Christ. General Douglas MacArthur made that famous statement at the close of his career when he declared to Congress, old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Well, I want you to know that old soldier of the cross, Marlin Jaynes Sr., my dad, did not fade away, but he praised God, and he was a witness for the Lord Jesus, even on his dying bed. How often during his dying hours, Dad would declare the praises of God and tell us he's going to heaven, saying amazing grace, even while he was suffering great pain. I heard, as I mentioned before, people would say, in the rooms around him, they were glad to hear him sing. Well, that time that Paul talks about in 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 8 says, I'm now ready to be offered at the time of my departure's hand. I fought a good fight. I've finished the course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, but the righteous judge shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but all that love is appearing. That's how we're ending this story. Many people depart this life, and few come back twice. Dad did. 10 years later, he died after being brain dead. But God blessed those 10 years. And my, what a wonderful, wonderful life it is. Many of you may be like me. I'm possibly facing death with this deadly cancer that I'm facing, and I will die unless there is a cure or God performs a miracle on my behalf. But I think of the scripture Paul also said as I conclude this story. 1 Corinthians 15:55. O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is thy victory? The answer is in verse 57. But thanks be to God, which giveth us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. My dad fought his final battle, and through Christ his Savior, the victory was won. He kept his course. My, what a wonderful miracle. I'm going to share just a couple of letters, and then I'm going to close. July the 19th, in 2001. This letter is a letter of vindication that says, to whom it may concern. In February of 1989, my friend Reverend Marlin Jaynes Jr. called from Florida to advise me that his father had suffered a severe heart attack the week before and had been declared brain dead by his physicians. The family had made the agonizing but logical decision to remove the life support that was keeping Reverend Jaynes Sr. alive and let the Lord have his way. Marlin asked me to do the preparation for the death return of his father's body to Bristol. I asked that Marlin have the hospital staff call us, that we would make arrangements to have the body of Reverend Jaynes prepared in Florida and flown to Bristol for a burial in the National Cemetery. I expect to receive that call from Florida any day. I do not remember the exact contact I had with Marlin. It could have been that he called me or that we saw each other at a funeral service Marlin was conducting. In any event, I learned that Reverend Jaynes Sr. had made a miraculous recovery. He went on fully to recover and live a normal life for the next 10 years. In May of 1999, Reverend Marlin S. Jaynes Sr. went to be with the Lord. The plans that Marlin Jr. and I had discussed 10 years prior were executed. We made funeral plans for Reverend Dr. Jaynes twice, 10 years apart. Signed, Sid Oakley, Oakley Cook Funeral Home, Bristol, Tennessee. One more letter from the Blue Ridge Family Physicians in Sport Medicine, Johnson City. It's dated March the 9th, 2002. Reverend Marlin Jaynes Jr., and it was addressed to me when I was pastoring after I left Bristol to Decatur, Illinois. It said, it was good to hear from you, and I'm glad things are going well in Illinois. It's a beautiful area, a little flatter than the hills of East Tennessee, but we really enjoyed visiting the area for the Notre Dame, Tennessee game back in November when the weather was good. That's from Dr. Mills. Those who know the story will never forget your father. I do not know what prompted his first visit with God in 1989, but I do know he had one. I do know why he was sent back for a second stay with us. I do not know, he said, but there must have been a good reason. I remember you calling me, asking me for advice. You were with him at the hospital in Florida after he had had a massive heart attack and cardiac arrest. The doctors there felt his brain went without oxygen too long to have any function left. He wasn't going to recover, and he would die as soon as the life support was removed, or so the test showed. One of the things that all doctors must remember is simply we're instruments. We're not the final arbitrator. I suppose that the doctors there in Florida had seen the same thing happen many times before, that they were unwilling to consider all possibilities, particularly the least likely one. They prepared you and the family for what is nearly always the inevitable outcome when somebody with clinical picture is taken off life support, a quick, rapid ceasing of all life functions. And when he began to breathe on his own, then they told you it was just a matter of moments. Then just later moments, it became a matter of hours. When hours became a full day, I remember your phone call to me back in Tennessee. Remembering you telling me that they were doing nothing for him. Literally, they had put him in a room, expecting him to die. No IVs, no medicine, nothing. And yet he began to breathe on his own, opened his eyes and looked around. I remember you telling me over the phone that in Florida that worse could happen, but that you would have him transferred here if I would receive him. I remember it took another day to get him transferred to our medical facility by air ambulance, and he was just as you described when he arrived, unable to speak, but as if he wanted to desperately tell something to me. He was very confused, unable to form words. I remember a fellow who had visited with God on the road to Damascus being described in a similar way. I remember offering him some water after he arrived to see if he would take it. He tried, and he was pretty clear at this point He wanted to stay with us. It took months of rehab for him to get back on his feet. And while he didn't remember much of what had happened to him, his memory of unimportant things being foggy, he retained the most important memories and values. He loved his Lord, his family, reading his Bible. I don't think I saw him without it. I was most pleased when you told me he had delivered a message one Sunday. And with that, he had truly made his way back until the Lord finally called him home 10 years later. I don't know why the Lord gave him back to you and after he literally died the first time, but there is surely a reason, if it is one we'll not know in this life. Miracles still do happen. They occur over and over again as he continued to improve. No one should ever doubt the power of prayer. We should realize that the Lord not only answers prayer in the way we expect, but sometimes in not the way we expect. I believe there are clearly among us those who, like your dad, have had a visit with the Lord and returned with us. They may not all come back the same way that Paul did, but they visited with the Lord just the same. I could go on and on talking about your father, and I will remember him always. I trust your family remains well in Illinois, and you always are in my prayer. Highest regard, Ralph L. Mills, MD. You know, I got one more letter, and I'm closing. It's from my good friend, Elmer Lester, Christian Fellowship Church minister in Kingsport, stated also on March the 13th, 2002. He said in 1985, fresh from the Mormon church where I served in the stake presidency and as a bishop, I was called to the Anderson Church of God in Bristol, Virginia, to be an associate to Marlin Jaynes Jr. At the church, I met Marlin Jaynes Sr. Brother Jaynes was a retired minister attending this church. With my background, I was really interested in this old fellow. He was a character, very dedicated, opinionated, firm in his beliefs, very loving and caring, especially for the down and out, as well as a handsome fellow and a good speaker. He had a lovely and good wife by his side. I like Brother and Sister Jaynes very much. They were faithful people, good examples for the rest of us. 1989, Brother Jaynes died. 3 brainwave tests showed no brain activity at all. Flatline. I think that's the term for it. Brother Jaynes was unhooked from his life support, but he just lay there and his heart kept beating, much to everyone's surprise. His brain started to function, and after 3 days, and boy, what a story he had to tell. Well, he was in heaven for 3 days. He saw people who were dead, his baby, his parents. Brother Jaynes was, after 3 days in heaven, sent back to bring sinners to Christ, to give people faith that they might be healed, to minister to children. How beautiful heaven must be. 10 years later, Brother Jaynes lay on his deathbed at the Johnson City Medical Center. He was ready to die. He wanted to die. Even here, he ministered. It seemed everyone was special to him. I remember this one story especially. 2 little sisters from the Anderson Church of God came to see him. They were kind, tender-hearted people. They loved Brother Jaynes and were very sad that he was sick. He turned his attention to them and ministered to them, had prayer with them. I know I saw a miracle there. A man who had been in heaven, trying to give his faith to others. Reverend Jaynes was a special man. I'm thankful to God that I have known him, to have heard his story. Elmer Lester. That's the story I'm going to complete with. And again, it's the Florida miracle. I hope this has brought some encouragement to you. It's encouraging to me. I see it's over an hour, and it's going to take some time to listen to it. But I hope that you know that God is still alive. I am hoping for a miracle myself, because without a miracle, I'm not going to be here much longer as I battle this liver cancer. But I have a hope and assurance. Jesus is my Lord. Someday I'm going to see my dad, my mom again, and all my loved ones in heaven. I hope the Florida miracle has been a blessing to you. If it has, share it with someone else. God bless you. This is Marlin Jaynes Jr. in Johnson City, Tennessee. My favorite saying is, hang in there. God has this thing. And I appreciate your prayers for me. Good day.